Have you ever wondered what it truly costs to be the dependable one? The quiet achiever in a family that only sees you when you're useful. Not admired, not celebrated, just conveniently invisible until needed. My name is Elena Maris, and for most of my life, I was the sister people forgot to mention in conversations, the daughter who never caused problems, the woman no one imagined would ever matter. They called me independent, as if that was a compliment, but what they really meant was disposable. I wasn't the fragile one. I wasn't the beautiful one. I wasn't the favorite. I was just there, quietly solving problems no one acknowledged, paying bills no one asked about, and building a life in the shadow of someone else's spotlight. But what happens when the invisible one builds an empire in silence? When the girl no one saw coming becomes the woman holding all the power? This is the story of how I stopped being their afterthought, and what happened when they found out too late. If you've ever been overlooked, underappreciated, or quietly underestimated, then you already know. Some storms don't come with thunder. Some arrive in silence and rewrite everything. I was born in a small coastal town in Oregon, where the air always smelled faintly of salt and pine, and every neighbor knew what time you came home for dinner. Life was slow there, steady, and my earliest memories are stitched together with the quiet kind of happiness that doesn't announce itself. My father, Elena Maris, was a woodworker who crafted custom furniture in a garage that smelled of cedar and sawdust. My mother, Celeste, worked as a school nurse, the kind who always had tissues, peppermints, and a quiet sigh waiting in her office. We didn't have much, but what we had felt like enough. Pancake Sundays, flashlight games in the backyard, sitting by the harbor as sailboats drifted by in the fog. Those were the small rituals that made my world feel safe. For the first 6 years of my life, I was the only child. And in that short window, I truly believed I was loved with full attention. My father made me tiny carved animals from scrap wood. My mother used to hum while brushing out my hair, her hands gentle and rhythmic, like a lullaby. They came to every school assembly, even the ones where I didn't win anything. We weren't perfect, but we were something close. Everything changed the year my little sister, Isla, was born. She arrived 2 months early during the last storm of March, so small and still that even the nurses lowered their voices around her. Her lungs were underdeveloped, and for the first few weeks, she lived in a hospital incubator, her body dotted with sensors and tubes. I remember standing outside the glass wall, clutching my father's hand, too young to understand why I couldn't touch her. My mother, pale and exhausted, stayed by Isla's side around the clock, her back curled like a question mark over the sterile crib. I tried to bring her a crayon drawing I'd made, us as a family of 4 standing under a rainbow, but she never looked up. "She can't get sick," was all she said when I tried to speak. When Isla finally came home, it was like the air in our house changed. Everything became clinical. My toys were boxed away because plastic carried germs. The windows were sealed. A giant air purifier roared day and night in the hallway. My room was moved to the basement, for safety, they said. Hand sanitizer appeared in every corner. I was told not to hug my sister, not to speak loudly near her, not to touch the remote unless I'd washed my hands twice. It was like living inside a museum exhibit, one where I was just a side note. My parents said they were doing the best they could. Maybe they were. But what I felt, at 6 years old, wasn't protection. It was exile. I'd gone from center to satellite overnight, from beloved to background, and no one noticed the difference except me. I learned early how to entertain myself. I started spending hours in the garage, where my father's tools lay silent and dusty from neglect. I'd tinker with old alarm clocks and broken radios, taking them apart just to see how they worked. I liked how machines made sense, how they only did what they were wired to do. No guessing, no shifting moods, no favoritism. When something broke, it was fixable. People weren't like that. Once, I told my mom I'd fix the old toaster. She blinked at me, then turned to ask if Isla had taken her vitamins yet. I stood there holding the warm metal box like it meant something. In that moment, I think a part of me stopped trying. Looking back, I see now that what I lost wasn't just attention, it was belonging. When Isla entered the world, I didn't just gain a sister. I lost a version of myself I would never get back. I became the quiet one, the capable one, the one who didn't need praise or affection. And slowly, without anyone saying it aloud, that became the role I was expected to play. I was the background character in my own story. And no one, not even me, knew yet how far I would go just to be seen again. The first time I realized I was no longer part of the family portrait, it wasn't dramatic. No screaming, no slammed doors, no sharp words. It was something much quieter, like a curtain being drawn over sunlight. I was 8 years old when my mother told me not to sit too close to Isla on the couch because your school clothes might carry bacteria. I looked down at my jeans, confused. They were clean, even smelled of fabric softener. But I stood up anyway. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were on Isla, who was babbling softly and clutching a plush rabbit I'd given her months before. It was one of the few things she hadn't rejected from me. From that day on, everything I did felt like a potential threat. If I sneezed, I was sent outside. If I coughed, I had to stay in the basement for the night. If I came home late from school, I had to shower immediately before I could even ask what was for dinner. My mother developed a habit of looking me up and down like I was a walking hazard. My father, once the man who carved me toy dinosaurs, just nodded along silently, tired and far away. I started keeping score without realizing it. Every drawing I tacked to the fridge was soon replaced by Isla's crayon scribbles. Every perfect test score I brought home was met with distracted smiles or a vague, "That's nice, honey." But when Isla said her first full sentence, we had cake. When she learned to tie her shoes, there were photos. When she had a nosebleed, they called 3 specialists. I once fell off the monkey bars and split my lip open. No one even asked if I needed stitches. By the time I was 10, the family had settled into a rhythm where I was more of a helper than a daughter. "Elena, can you keep Isla busy while I take a call?" "Elena, grab the wipes, quick. Isla's having a reaction." "Elena, please don't make noise. Your sister is resting." I complied. What else could I do? Refuse and look selfish? Demand attention and be told to grow up? So I stayed quiet. I learned how to disappear while being present. But what hurt most wasn't being forgotten. It was how they rewrote the story while I was still living in it. At parent-teacher night, I overheard my mother telling my science teacher, "Elena's always been strong and low maintenance. She understands her sister needs extra care." No, I didn't. I didn't understand why love had conditions. I didn't understand why my pain didn't qualify as real. I didn't understand how 2 people who once whispered bedtime stories into my ear now barely remembered my favorite color. Things got worse when I turned 12. One night, I overheard my parents talking to a visiting geneticist in hushed tones. Something about carriers and non-expressed traits. Later that evening, my mother sat me down and said carefully, "We need to be extra cautious with you, sweetie. There's a chance you could be a silent carrier, which means, well, it's nothing to worry about now, but let's just be safe." Didn't know what that meant then. I just knew that after that night, hugs disappeared completely. My birthday gifts became practical items: hand sanitizer, vitamins, a new humidifier for my basement room. I'd been downgraded from daughter to liability, from person to precaution. And yet, I still tried. I brought home an award from the regional science fair, first place for building a homemade radio receiver. My mom smiled politely and asked if I remembered to sanitize my hands before touching the doorknob. That was the day my light went out. I stopped talking at dinner, stopped volunteering for school activities, stopped asking to invite friends over. Instead, I retreated deeper into the only place where I felt like myself. The old garden shed behind our house, now converted into a storage space. I strung up a desk lamp, plugged in a salvaged radio, and spent hours in there tuning into static-filled signals, pretending I was talking to someone out in the world who could actually hear me. By age 13, I was more technician than teenager. I taught myself how to solder, how to decode Morse, how to fix vintage electronics that no one cared about anymore. I scavenged broken electronics from recycling bins and yard sales, using birthday money I'd secretly saved. No one asked why I spent so much time out there. As long as I stayed invisible and useful, the house ran smoothly. But one rainy afternoon changed everything. I'd spent weeks restoring an antique voice recorder I'd found at a flea market. It was delicate and beautiful. Brass, leather-trimmed, with tiny etched markings in the corners. When I played the first recovered clip, it crackled out a voice. That said, to whoever finds this, your hands are holding history. I nearly cried. I ran into the house, soaked and trembling with excitement, eager to show my father what I'd done. He glanced at the recorder, then back at his phone. That's cool, he muttered. But could you take the trash out before dinner? That was the last time I brought any creation inside the house. That was the last time I asked to be seen. From then on, I didn't want applause. I wanted freedom. I didn't know how I'd earn it yet, but I could feel it building inside me like static. Not the kind that causes sparks, but the kind that powers something enormous when no one's looking. By the time high school started, my place in the family was cemented. I was the one who made life easier, the one who didn't need supervision, reminders, or affection. Isla was the sun around which everything revolved, and I had learned to keep my orbit silent, predictable, and out of the way. She'd grown into a delicate, graceful teenager with big eyes, soft features, and a strangely powerful fragility. People were drawn to protect her, even if they didn't know why. My parents used words like resilient and gifted when they talked about me, but their tone always held a hint of justification, like they needed to explain why they weren't worried about me. Elena's always been practical, they'd say. She doesn't need much. I didn't need much. That part was true. But that was because I knew there wasn't much coming. I spent my evenings working part-time at a bicycle repair shop 2 towns over. It was run by a retired engineer named Lou, who didn't say much, but had a soft spot for kids who kept their heads down and their tools clean. I loved the quiet rhythm of repair, the logic of it, the way broken things could be put back together, with just enough care and the right-sized wrench. I stayed late almost every shift, partly for the overtime and partly because it felt like the only place where no one expected me to vanish behind someone else's crisis. At school, I was top of my class. I joined the robotics team, competed in state science competitions, built a home automation system using salvaged parts, and got a near-perfect PSAT score. But every time I came home with news, it was met with tired nods and distracted glances. "That's great," my dad would say, halfway through adjusting Isla's medication schedule. "We're proud of you," my mom would offer, without even looking up from her laptop, where she was researching a new therapy diet Isla wanted to try. Then, senior year, something unexpected happened. I was invited to present a project at a regional innovation fair, a voice-to-text app I had coded for students with motor impairments. I'd created it for extra credit after tutoring a student who had trouble writing due to a neurological condition. My app wasn't revolutionary, but it worked, and it worked well. My computer science teacher nominated it without even telling me until I got the acceptance email. The night before the event, I nervously asked my parents if they'd come. Isla looked up from her phone and said, "Oh, I think I have rehearsal that day." She'd recently joined a community choir for people with artistic sensitivity, a vague but charming-sounding program that my parents treated like a calling. My mom frowned thoughtfully and said, "I don't think we'll be able to swing it, honey. You know how hard it is to find someone to stay with Isla." I nodded. Of course I knew. They didn't come, but I went anyway. I took the bus 3 hours each way, slept in a shared hostel room with strangers, and wore my only clean blazer. I gave the presentation to a panel of judges, some of whom asked thoughtful questions, and others who smiled politely and moved on. It wasn't a grand victory, but for the first time, someone outside my family saw something I built and said, "This has potential." A few weeks later, I learned that a nonprofit focused on accessibility had picked up the idea. They offered to license the basic version of my code and build it out into a public service tool. The agreement wasn't worth much, maybe a few $1,000s and some networking contacts. But it was the first time something I created made it into the world. When I told my parents, they were pleased but not impressed. What caught their attention wasn't the app, but the press coverage Isla received after her choir posted about her inspirational journey. The local newspaper ran a photo of her with the caption, "Young Survivor Sings for Change." My app was never mentioned. They assumed it had been inspired by Isla's needs. They told their friends that I was just helping the community, thanks to everything we've learned from Isla. At that point, I stopped correcting them. It wasn't worth it. Instead, I started building my future in silence. I researched scholarships at night and secretly applied to 10 universities. I wrote essays at the bike shop between shifts. I filled out FAFSA forms on the library computers after hours. Lou, the shop owner, wrote me a recommendation letter without asking any questions, just handed it to me one day and said, "Some things deserve to move forward." When the acceptance letters came in, I didn't tell anyone. I just quietly chose a mid-sized engineering school in San Francisco that offered me a full ride. I planned every detail myself, from student housing to book costs to what bus routes ran near the dorms. My parents didn't know I was leaving until the week before move-in. They were surprised, a little annoyed that I hadn't asked for help. My mom sighed and said, "We would have supported you if you'd said something." I just nodded. Supported how? With what energy? With what time? My dad looked vaguely proud. Isla barely acknowledged it, and I packed my bags alone. The night before I left, I sat in the garden shed for the last time, staring at the soldered lines of a circuit board I'd been restoring. It still needed work, but I decided to leave it unfinished. A reminder, maybe, that sometimes even beautiful things are better left behind. Moving to San Francisco felt like arriving on another planet. The fog still clung to the mornings like back home, but everything else was sharper, louder, faster. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who didn't know my family, didn't expect me to play the role of the quiet, competent girl in the background. They only saw what I showed them, and that was liberating in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Still, I didn't arrive with wide-eyed wonder or naive dreams. I came with a plan, a thrifted laptop, and exactly $812 saved from years of part-time work. I couldn't afford the dorms, so I rented space in the back of an old van that belonged to a journalism major named Ray, who needed help with car repairs and didn't ask too many questions. Classes were demanding, but compared to everything I'd navigated at home, the pressure felt manageable. What drained me more was the silence from my family. My parents called occasionally, always with updates about Isla, her new therapy sessions, her singing performances, how stressful college applications were for her. No one asked how I was adjusting. No one asked where I was living. I gave polite updates, careful not to sound bitter or too successful. I didn't want to provoke guilt. Or worse, pride without understanding. Outside of classes, I took on freelance repair jobs, vintage cassette decks, old Nikon cameras, one even a rotary phone someone's grandmother had left behind. I quickly realized there was a growing market for analog tech restorations. At first, it was just collectors and hobbyists. But then came a job offer from a production designer working on a period film, asking if I could refurbish a 1980s reel-to-reel deck for a scene. That job led to another, and soon I had a notebook full of referrals. I started calling my side work the Fennec Project, named after the tiny desert fox, sharp-eared, quick, often overlooked but always listening. It was a fitting metaphor. I wasn't the loudest, I wasn't the flashiest, but I heard everything, and I knew how to restore things others thought were long dead. My big break came quietly, the way most real opportunities do. A private collector had brought in what she believed was a reproduction of an old first-generation Walkman. She just wanted it cleaned for display. But the moment I opened the casing, I felt it. The craftsmanship, the subtle flaws in the soldering, the unusual weight distribution. I ran the serial number and nearly dropped my screwdriver. It was a prototype. Not one of the public release models, but an early test build with a manufacturer code that had long been thought lost. Only 5 were ever made, and this was number 2. I authenticated it, wrote a detailed provenance report, and helped her list it with a specialty auction house. It sold for $70,000. She thanked me with a smile and a generous cut of the proceeds. That money became seed capital. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't post about it online. I just went to the nearest secondhand office supply store, bought a desk and a used filing cabinet, and rented a 200-square-foot studio in the back of a former warehouse. And that's how Fennec Revival Lab was born. In the years that followed, I built the business the way I had learned to build everything else, quietly, meticulously, without expecting applause. I reinvested every dollar, hired part-time help from local trade schools, learned business law from free online courses. I stayed under the radar. No flashy branding, no media interviews, no TED Talks. Just word of mouth and a waiting list that got longer every month. By my 4th year in the city, I had full-time contracts with 2 film studios, a recurring project with a European museum, and custom requests from private estates across the country. I was living in a modest apartment above a flower shop in the Mission District, driving a used electric car and still eating instant ramen 3 nights a week. Not because I had to, but because it reminded me where I started. All the while, my family remained comfortably unaware. When they called, it was always about Isla, her new course load in college, her brand taking off on social media, makeup reviews, inspirational reels, pastel-filtered lifestyle posts. My mom would casually mention that Isla was thinking of launching her own design studio, and how stressful it is for her to manage it all. Sometimes I would hear Isla in the background laughing, her voice light and careless. They never asked what I did, never wondered how I paid my rent. They assumed I was still cobbling things together, a quirky tech girl living paycheck to paycheck. Once, my dad even suggested I apply for an administrative role at the local library for stability. I said thank you and changed the subject. The money didn't matter to me. The growth, the contacts, the quiet influence I had earned in a niche industry. They were tools. But what I really valued was the power of not needing anything from anyone anymore. For the first time in my life, I was not defined by how useful I was to other people. And yet, there was one detail I kept close. One that felt almost sacred. Every month, without fail, I sent my parents $1,000, then $2,000, then $3,500. I labeled the transfers vaguely: support, medical costs, tuition help. I never mentioned it. They never asked. I knew the money went to Isla. I knew they assumed it came from some government grant, or maybe a generous scholarship fund they had forgotten about. I didn't send it because they deserved it. I sent it because I could. Because giving silently was something they had never done for me. And somewhere, deep down, I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, kindness could still exist without recognition. But even quiet kindness has a breaking point. And mine was coming, faster than any of us could see. The older I got, the easier it became to remain invisible, not because I was hiding, but because the people closest to me had already decided what I was worth. I was the helper, the problem solver, the fallback plan in case something didn't work out for Idla. It wasn't hostility, not exactly. It was worse. It was casual erasure, the kind of disregard that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't even see you there. And so I leaned into it. I let them believe whatever they wanted. By the time I was 27, Fennec Revival Lab had grown beyond anything I'd imagined in that cold, cluttered garden shed years ago. I operated 2 satellite labs, one in Los Angeles for film clients, another in Seattle for museum partnerships. I had 6 employees, all sharp, curious minds who respected detail as much as I did. We didn't advertise. We didn't need to. If you had a rare heirloom, a forgotten artifact, a piece of analog history, you came to us, or you risked misidentifying something priceless. My personal net worth had crossed $8 million, with an additional $3 million tied up in authentication contracts and long-term licensing deals. I lived in a quiet townhouse in a tree-lined neighborhood just outside the city, drove a neutral silver hybrid, wore simple clothes, and carried an older model phone. None of it was out of humility. I just didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Meanwhile, my family continued to believe I was still tinkering with old junk. They assumed my rent was low, that I lived off leftover grant money or the occasional client handout, and I let them believe it. What would be the point of telling them the truth? They weren't interested. Every time they reached out, it was to talk about Isla. Her influencer account had reached 40,000 followers. Her new skincare line was in development. She was exploring a podcast about wellness. They sent me links to her posts with pastel, filters and captions like thriving, not surviving, and healing is expensive but worth it. I recognized the designer bags in her photos. I'd paid for them. Quietly, through my monthly transfers, through tuition deposits labeled support, through emergency fund wires that came with no questions and received no thanks. I didn't mind, not at first. It felt like a form of emotional severance, a way to buy peace. But over time, something shifted. I began noticing inconsistencies. Isla's tuition was supposedly covered, yet she was never in classes. My parents mentioned her working hard, but she seemed to always be on vacation. Greece in spring, Aspen in winter, Tulum for her birthday. Her captions hinted at success, but I saw no substance. My mother would call and say, "She's finally finding her voice, Elena, but she's under so much pressure. If only she had more stability to build something meaningful." That's when I realized the story hadn't changed. It had just adapted. I was still the means to an end, the silent donor, the financial scaffolding for a life that looked nothing like mine. And then came the car. A limited edition imported electric coupe, sleek, rare, not yet available on the US market. I recognized it instantly because I'd helped authenticate one just like it for a European client. Isla posted a photo with the caption, "Hard work pays off, treating myself for getting through a rough semester." The likes flooded in, so did the comments. Girl boss energy. Manifested luxury. You deserve it. I stared at the screen for a long time. I did the math. That car cost over $90,000. And Isla had never held a job. She had never completed a degree. She didn't build anything. She didn't even answer emails on time. So who was paying for it? The next week, my mother called. Her tone was sweet, careful. "Elena, honey, I wanted to thank you again for helping with Isla's needs, but we're in a bit of a tight spot. Isla's thinking of expanding her brand. Interior design is her real passion now, and Parsons has an amazing program. But the tuition waited. We were wondering if you might be able to increase your monthly support to, say, $7,000? just for a while, until she gets on her feet. I was sitting at my desk when she said it, reviewing documents for a 6-figure authentication of a Soviet-era surveillance recorder. The timing almost made me laugh. My mother was talking about sacrifice while I was approving payroll for 7 employees and finalizing our partnership with a private auction house in Berlin. I didn't answer right away. I just looked around my office, the carefully restored drafting table, the climate-controlled cabinet of vintage tech, the framed schematic of the first transistor radio I ever rebuilt. Everything here was mine. Everything had been earned piece by piece, in silence. I said yes, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to reach the end of the rope on my own terms. And still, they never asked what I did. My father once joked, "We'll never understand what you really do all day. You're probably just gluing wires to toasters." Isla laughed. My mother smiled vaguely. No one asked about the pearl pendant I wore, once owned by a French industrialist's widow. No one noticed the rare Swiss timepiece on my desk, or the signed letter from a film director thanking me for preserving a prop that had once been lost to time. To them, I was still the girl with a hobby, the girl who just happened to always have cash when they needed it. But I was no longer interested in being understood. I was only interested in one thing now, being seen, not for their sake, for mine. And the moment that would change everything was closer than they knew. I hadn't planned to host Thanksgiving that year. In fact, I was quietly preparing to spend the long weekend alone, maybe cataloging a collection of Cold War-era signal jammers I had just acquired from an estate in Prague. But then my mother called, her voice softer than usual, laced with a kind of practiced vulnerability that only surfaced when she wanted something. "No one's really up to cooking this year," she said. "We thought maybe you'd like to host. You always make things feel special." I almost said no, but something in me shifted. Maybe I was tired of being invisible. Maybe I was ready. Maybe I wanted them to see what I'd become, even if they didn't deserve to. "Sure," I said. "I'll take care of it." And I did. But not in the way they expected. I hired a catering company from Napa I had worked with during private gallery events. They specialized in high-end, small-scale dinners, multi-course seasonal menus, sommelier pairings, and an aesthetic team that could turn any table into something worthy of a design magazine spread. I paid the full invoice with one of my company's cards, the same one I used to fund international travel for rare object inspections. No one asked how. No one ever had. That morning, I arrived early at my parents' house with the catering crew, following close behind. They brought portable ovens, silver trays, antique flatware, and fresh flower arrangements that looked like they had been lifted out of a European conservatory. Isla stood at the foot of the staircase watching them unload, brow raised. "Wow," she muttered under her breath. "Looks like someone's trying to impress a date." I didn't respond. I just smiled. By 5 o'clock, the house was filled with relatives, distant cousins, aunts, uncles, my grandparents, even Isla's new boyfriend, who worked in crypto and wore designer shoes with no socks. The table looked stunning. The food was exquisite. No one asked who paid for it. They just ate, drank, and complimented Isla on her new creative energy and her plans for an interior design studio. I poured wine. I served dishes. I smiled. And then, just as I stepped away to check on a live auction taking place in Tokyo, one of my longtime clients was bidding on a Soviet military comms transmitter. Isla barged into my old room without knocking. "Do you have a charger?" she asked, eyes already scanning the room. Before I could answer, she spotted my open laptop on the desk. She paused. "What's this?" she asked, moving closer, already reaching. I stood, but not fast enough. She picked up the laptop, eyes narrowing as she processed what she saw. Multiple tabs open, each labeled with auction results, wire transfer, confirmations, Client contracts. One tab clearly showed a business account balance, $12.6 million. Another listed a pending international verification deal worth nearly $500,000. "Oh my God," she said, half laughing. "What is this? Who are you helping now? Elon Musk?" Then, without warning, she marched out of the room with the laptop in her hands and into the dining room. "Hey, everyone," she called out. "Look what Elena's working on during Thanksgiving." The tea. Screen faced the room, glowing with data. Account numbers, company logos, valuations. I followed her into the room, calmly, and stopped just behind her. The silence was instant. My father's fork froze midair. My grandmother blinked at the screen. My mother's face went pale, then flushed red. No one said anything. Then my mom laughed nervously. "Come on now. Elena's probably just helping someone with paperwork. Right, sweetheart?" I stepped forward and spoke clearly, my voice even. "No, Mom. I'm not helping anyone. I'm the one signing those contracts. I own the business. I'm the founder and CEO of Fennec Revival Lab. I operate labs in 3 cities. I specialize in antique technology authentication. Everything you're seeing is mine." The silence that followed wasn't just stunned. It was offended. A spoon clattered against a plate. Aunt Carla's mouth fell open. My father leaned back in his chair like he'd been hit. Isla stared at the screen, her face frozen in confusion that looked a lot like betrayal. "You," she said, her voice shaking. "You've had this kind of money all this time, while Mom and Dad are in debt because of me?" My mother turned sharply. "You've been sending us money, haven't you?" I nodded once. $7,000 a month, for over 2 years. You never asked where it came from. My father stood up. "You should have told us. That's not how family works. Families share." I looked around the room and saw not a single expression of pride. Only disappointment that I hadn't been more generous, more available, more willing to stay small. "I sent that money," I said, "because I could. Not because you earned it, and certainly not because you ever believed in me." Isla's voice rose. "I'm your sister. I have a right to know." "No," I said, steady as ever. "You had years to care, and you didn't. You saw me as a tool, a fallback plan, someone who'd always be there to make your dreams more convenient." My mother's voice cut in again, harder now. "We thought you were struggling. We pitied you. And you were sitting on millions?" My laugh was low, but it cut the room in half. "You pitied me? I've been your backup generator while you powered Isla's fantasy life. That BMW? I recognized the model. You think a design student can afford that on hope and hashtags?" My father slammed his palm on the table. "You are still our daughter. That money could have helped this entire family." I met his eyes. "No," I said. "That money helped this family already, quietly, consistently, without expectation. But tonight, it ends." I pulled out my phone, opened the banking app, and canceled the monthly transfer right there in front of them. The room exploded. My mother screamed, my father shouted about duty, Isla cried into her boyfriend's shoulder. But none of it touched me. I felt calm, detached. Like the eye of a storm I had spent my entire life trying to avoid finally passed over me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand anything. I just said one thing as I turned toward the door. If the only reason any of you want me here is because I pay the bills, then you don't want me. You want a wallet with my face on it. And I'm done being that. I walked out with my head high, my silence louder than any outburst. And for the first time in my life, they had to sit with what they never thought to see. Me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't cry either. Instead, I sat in my apartment by the window, the same one that overlooked the small courtyard, with the string lights I'd hung myself last winter, and listened to the silence. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of weight. It was the first time in years I didn't feel the burden of responsibility pressing between my shoulder blades like a second spine. The only thing I felt was clarity. By morning, the text messages had begun. My mother first. "We need to talk. You didn't handle that well. Lily is inconsolable." Then my father. "This isn't how you treat family, Elena. You've changed." 37. Messages later, Isla's voice finally appeared in my inbox. "You've ruined everything." I hope it was worth it. I didn't respond. The next day, my company's public email account was flooded with spam. At first, it looked random, but I recognized some of the names. Extended relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, a former family friend, even the wife of one of my dad's coworkers. Their messages ranged from veiled guilt to overt threats. "You owe your parents. You wouldn't have gotten where you are without them. We always knew you were ungrateful." One message simply said, "Hope your precious little lab burns to the ground. I hired a lawyer." His name was Marcus Chen. Clean-cut, discreet, and used to dealing with estate disputes among wealthy families. When I showed him the thread of messages, his expression didn't change. "This happens more than you think," he said calmly. "The moment people find out they can't control you through guilt, they try to shame you into submission. Let's shut it down." We sent out formal cease and desist letters to every name on the list. Marcus included a final line at my request. "Love, if it exists, should never arrive as an invoice." I don't know if anyone really read it. I don't know if it changed anything, but I needed it to be said. A week later, Isla posted a carefully crafted statement on social media, a carousel of old photos, me holding her as a baby, me at her graduation, me smiling politely in the background at her birthday dinner. The caption read like a gentle eulogy. "Not everyone who has money has a heart. I just wish things could have been different. Some people forget where they came from." The comments were split. Some of her followers called me cold, heartless, even abusive. Others asked why an empowered young woman needed to rely on her sister's bank account to begin with. I didn't engage. I had no interest in winning a popularity contest. My name was never mentioned directly. But the implication was clear. I was the villain in her fairy tale. Instead of replying, I opened a wooden box tucked in the corner of my closet. Inside was the vintage pendant my grandmother had given me when I was 15, a single pearl set in soft gold. It wasn't valuable in the traditional sense, but it was the first thing anyone had ever given me with love and no conditions. Called her that night. She wasn't surprised by what had happened. She just listened, then said, "I always knew you were different. Not harder, just stronger. You finally stopped paying to be misunderstood." A week later, I invited her to stay with me. She arrived with a small suitcase and a tin of butter cookies she'd made herself. We spent the evenings going through a collection of rare Swiss circuit boards I was prepping for a museum exhibit. She didn't ask about the drama. She didn't tell me to forgive. She just sat beside me and said, "They never saw what you carried, but I do." After that, I changed everything. I scrubbed my personal information from the company's database, updated all my legal contacts. My assistant was instructed not to accept walk-ins without pre-approval. I moved into a new home, a quiet mid-century villa tucked on the edge of Sausalito with a view of the bay and a secure vault room that held our rarest pieces. I furnished it myself. Warm lights, vintage cabinets, and a studio with amber windows that caught the light just right. The silence from my family was deafening, but it no longer hurt. It just proved what I already knew. They didn't miss me. They missed what I gave them. In the months that followed, Fennec Revival Lab expanded. Our third location opened in Austin. We signed new contracts with European auction houses and launched a fellowship for young restorers from underrepresented backgrounds. My name began appearing in magazines, not for scandals, but for preservation. Work that had saved pieces of history once thought lost forever. During a quarterly meeting, my CFO asked if I was ready to acquire a competitor in the Southeast. I paused, then nodded. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I was done shrinking. This was never about power. It was about permission. And for the first time, I didn't need anyone's. Elena's story isn't just about family. It's about freedom. It's a quiet revolution that many high-achieving, emotionally sidelined people will recognize when the one who's always been the safety net decides to walk away. Psychologists refer to this as emotional parentification, where a child is assigned the role of caretaker, problem solver, or stabilizer, often without being given any support in return. Over time, that child learns to expect nothing and give everything. But the real damage comes when their success is still viewed as selfishness. What Elena chose wasn't cruelty. It was correction. A shift from being used to being whole, from being needed to being respected. Her silence wasn't a grudge. It was grace, because sometimes the greatest act of love you can offer yourself is leaving the room where you were never truly seen. What do you think? Have you ever been the invisible one in your own story until you finally said, enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. And if this story moved you even a little, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives about strength, justice, and finding your voice in the most unexpected places, because your story matters, and someone out there is waiting to hear it.